Alright, so I've had the Enduro for a little over a year now, and I think it's finally time to tell you guys all the things that I love about it and all the things I hate about it. So let's start off with the things that I don't really like about the Enduro. You could almost say I hate these things about the Enduro. And the first thing is probably really obvious. It's the price. This bike is super expensive. I'm not sure that it's a great value. There's a ton of direct-to-consumer brands like the YT Capra I used to have, which are way better value. The top-end Capra is only like 8,500 or 9,000 Canadian with Fox factory suspension and carbon wheels and all sorts of stuff like that. And I think top-of-the-line derailleur, pretty much the best of everything you can get, all for under $9,000. Whereas this was 8,500. I mean, not as it stands right now. I upgraded quite a few parts. So at 8,500 Canadian, it came with the Fox 36, but with only the grip damper. It did have carbon wheels, which were nice, but they were the specialized roll ball wheels, which are okay. But it had those 370 hubs, whichever the worst ones are that you can't upgrade, which is like, okay, why are you gonna have carbon wheels with just the worst hubs that you can't even upgrade? It was definitely annoying that it came with carbon wheels, which I did kind of like. But they came with such terrible hubs that I immediately knew I wanted to switch those out. Pairing super cheap hubs with pretty nice rims is kind of a weird combo, and I didn't really like that about this bike. And while it did come with an X01 shifter and derailleur, it had a GX cassette, which I think I'd probably want a nicer cassette than a nicer derailleur, just because those cheaper cassettes are actually quite heavy. And again, it came with kind of just an okay crankset with the descendant cranks. So the first thing that I hated about this bike was the price. The value just isn't necessarily there. And this probably could have fit into my value complaints as well, but the DPX2 shock that it came with made the rear end of this bike just never feel great for me. The rear shock that it came with and the way it was set up and sort of the kinematics for someone like me, a taller, bigger guy, just never felt right. They felt pretty good in the parking lot and kind of bobbing around, but when you got into the chunky, fast stuff, it would feel really sort of tight and chattery, and it never really felt that soft. It was like, why do I have all the suspension if it doesn't really feel like I have all the suspension? It was feeling really rough and weird, and it took me a while to kind of figure it out that I couldn't tune the shock the way I like it, which is why I ended up going with this DHX2 coil shock. So that was the second thing I hated about this bike. When it did have the DPX2, it actually didn't feel very good in the rear end for me. I could never get the suspension to feel right, and well, I really hated that, and that's part of the reason I tried out so many bikes. I wanted to see what the heck was going on. Another thing that I hated about this bike was it always had kind of weird rattles going on. You couldn't really hear it in the video. So another thing I hated about this bike was it had this weird rattle that was going on that took me quite a while to actually figure it out. You could never really hear it in the videos. People actually say my bike is actually quite quiet, which I think it is overall quite a quiet bike, especially compared to how they used to be. But there was always this sort of like, this rattle that I could feel. I could feel it in the bars is what it really was. And what it turned out to be is the swat box isn't a really tight tolerance. It's kind of loose on there. So this whole big lid here kind of just rattles around on top of the bike and kind of thud, 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 thud. So you'd be riding, you'd be going through some, chundery stuff, and then you would hear this plastic piece just raging around, especially when you had a big water bottle in it full of water. You just hear thud, 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 or feel it in the bars, and that always really annoyed me. And for such an expensive bike from such a big brand, seems like a pretty easy thing to fix. They could have just put rubber around, like had it kind of press and seal in better. It's a good design, but the execution could just use a bit of polishing. And the way that I actually fixed that is I just took a bunch of tape and I just taped all the edges around so that when I put this on, it kind of squishes all together, makes a nice tight seal. And that seems to more or less have helped it. Now that the tapes are worn in and starting to rattle again, I'll have to do it again, but yeah, just seems unnecessary, and the rattling drove me crazy. And sort of the last thing that I would say that I hated about this bike, maybe hate's a strong word, but at times it can feel pretty big. I think now we see a lot of bikes going bigger and longer and slacker, and as a former BMXer, that doesn't necessarily fit my style. So there was quite a few times where I'd be riding the Enduro and when you get into sort of that tight stuff, or you need the maneuverability, or you kind of want to pop around a bit, it just felt like such a big bike that it was kind of difficult to keep your momentum or keep your speed. That did and does still kind of drive me crazy about the bike, but that doesn't tell the whole story. There is a huge upside to having a big, long, slack bike. It just was in certain scenarios. I'm sure we can all appreciate that having such a big bike, and not so much the suspension, the actual geometry, the long chainstay, the slack bike, the slack head tube angle, that's sort of the geometry, the big wheels, all that kind of paired together is what made the bike feel really big. So the last thing I sort of hated about this bike was that it was quite big and quite cumbersome. There are definitely times where having a smaller bike would have just been a bit more fun. Alright, we've made it through my complaints about this bike. And honestly, it's actually really hard to complain about. All those things that I said that I hated about the Enduro, it's... I feel like I'm probably nitpicking quite a bit. It's honestly quite a good bike, and here are the things that I really loved about it. Now, the first thing that I really liked about this bike, and that I immediately noticed when I hopped on it at the shop, was it pedals really well. For a 170 Enduro bike, which is quite heavy now with all the parts that I have on it, it pedals great. I've ridden quite a few other big Enduros now, and this one, yeah, it's gotta be one of the best. I've even ridden smaller bikes. I thought, oh, the Enduro, it pedals so well. A shorter travel bike, they're gonna climb even better, and I'll be able to get more laps in, or have a bit more fun, or not be so tired. But I rode a few other smaller bikes, and I never really felt like, oh wow, I'm just zipping up the mountain. I think because the Enduro is such a good climber already, I feel like you're really only losing that little bit of efficiency that you might get from having smaller travel, but I really do love how well this thing pedals. And that also meant that for such a big bike, it has quite a bit of pop. Even though it's such a big, slack, long suspension bike, it still bunny hops in corners and does all that stuff really well, which again, you can't really appreciate until you go out and try some other bikes, but for how big this bike is, it's impressive how playful it is. Not super playful, but given the context, quite good. Now, I did say that this swap box rattles around a lot, but I love having a swap box. Having a box in your frame just makes so much sense. I have a jacket in there right now in case it gets too cold. Then I haven't worn a pack in so long. My next bike, whatever that is, well, hopefully I'll have it in the next month or so, and you'll get to find out too. It's probably not gonna have a box in the frame, and I think I'm gonna have to go back to wearing a hip pack, which kind of sucks. I love the swap box, and I actually love the SWAT tool as well. It's in the headset, sort of like all the other, see if I can do this without knocking my bike over. The SWAT tool is in the headset, just like, you know, all the other tools we see, but it's super accessible, and it's, you know, it's just a little Allen key, not the best tools, but when you need an Allen key, it's just nice, it's small, it's light, it's right in the headset, it's super easy to get out. It's slide the thing to the side, take out the tool, it's ready to go, no faffing about or anything like that. I think the SWAT system is probably my favorite bike storage accessory tool system out there right now. It's quite good, and I'm going to miss it, that's for sure. Now, I know in my list of complaints I complained about how big and cumbersome it could be, but honestly, it's so well-rounded, that's totally acceptable. This is definitely a do-it-all bike. I rode it on some really big, long days, some big climbs, and it felt totally fine. And when I got to the descent, it was nice having just basically a downhill bike. And after riding this bike in the park, this bike felt totally fine in the park. I actually really liked it. The long chainstay, the slack head tube angle, the longness of the bike, even the 29-inch wheels, all came together to make the bike feel really great. So if you had just one bike where you wanted to ride a bike park, you wanted to do big climbs, you wanted to pedal it all over the place, but still be able to go down the hill as hard as you possibly could, I honestly thought for how big it is, it did everything really well. And now that I have the coil shock on there, I think maybe there was some compromise in the suspension kinematics to make it pedal really well that made it not so great, not so supple sort of in the kinematics, so it didn't always feel the best going downhill. But I think for, someone bigger like me, putting the coil shock on there has really solved that problem. Now it's amazing downhill. It's supple, it's got enough support for me, it all feels pretty great. Still pedals really well because the new DHX2 coil has actually a pretty good firm lockout, which I do end up using now. I would say most of the time I loved having a big, long, slack bike. The amount of fun and stability I had riding it in the park and on big jumps and stuff like that vastly outweighed the few times that I was kind of annoyed where the bike was big and I had a tight corner to try and turn or keep up with someone. So yeah, I actually did love having such a big bike. And the final things that I loved about this bike are really that it's such a good looking bike. Especially, I think the black S-Works frame and with my black Noble wheels and the gold TRP brakes. I just like looking at it. It's quite a good looking bike. And I think I should give a shout out to Specialized's warranty, because when I bought my bike, as a lot of you know, I cracked it pretty soon on, but Specialized had a new frame for me within a week. And no, there wasn't any sort of YouTuber special deal going on. I bought it from a shop that didn't really know I made videos, as far as I know, and they contacted Specialized for me, and I'm sure that they wouldn't have said anything, and Specialized wouldn't have really known that I had this bike, or it was me who broke the frame. So as far as I know, that's just how they treat their customers. Now I'm sure there's been some delays this year, but back when frames were more or less available, they had a new frame to me quite fast, and I was out riding, a week later. That was pretty nice. So I loved that. Not really about the bike, maybe about the brand and the shop and all that, but yeah, I thought that was pretty good. So that's it. Those are my thoughts, my final thoughts on this bike. And these are final thoughts because I'm actually going to be getting rid of this bike and getting a new bike, hopefully pretty soon-ish. I've been waiting for it for actually a really long time, and supply chains are a little slow right now. So I just wanted to make this video and just talk about the bike now that I've had it for a year, just overall what it's been like. And it's been pretty great. I would say this is an A+ bike. It's quite hard to actually complain about it. It's almost all upsides. It's really about finding the bike that fits you, your riding style, your weight, your height, all those sort of things, the area you ride in. All that stuff needs to all kind of come together for you to find the perfect bike for you, and I think this bike was pretty good for how I like to ride. So those of you with Enduros, or those of you who have tried Enduros, or those of you who have just seen videos about Enduros, let me know, what do you like about this bike? Actually, what do you hate about this bike? I'd like to see more complaints, because it's so hard to complain about these bikes. What's the complaints? I need to hear them, because I think it's just too easy to talk about all the good things. You know what? Let's just start complaining. All right, I'll see you guys in the next one. Oh, and I will be posting about my new bike and all that kind of stuff on Patreon as soon as I can, which again, hopefully should be in the first few weeks. And all my videos come out a week early there, and that's a place where you can support the channel. So if you want to check out all that stuff, link to the Patreon is down in the description. And now, I'll see you guys in the next one.